welcome to That Good Fight, a Reformation for Gentlemen. My name is Aaron Edwards. I'm joined by the great Tom Caldecott in the room, and far across the stretches of Middle Earth is Nathan Paler.
Yeah, all the way to the northeast. Hello.
All the way to the northeast. That's where you are. Ah, you're up north. Yeah. I was going to do a northeasterly accent there. I was like,
I want to hear that.
I'm going to refrain. Why, aye, man.
You can't confuse Smoggies and Townie and Geordies, and that's a mortal.
Who are Smoggies? Is that Newcastle?
Well, Smoggies is Teesside, and then Geordies are those on the Tyne.
Ah, okay, yeah, okay.
I'm learning
there
something.
We go. That's it. There's so much to learn, and actually, there's so much we could actually. I think this could probably fit for what we're going to talk about today, because we are going to talk about multiculturalism. Because it's kind of a hot topic, isn't it? In general, it always is, regardless of what is. Whenever you're listening to this, if you are in the Western world at all, multiculturalism will be a hot topic. It will be something that is affecting your life and your community and your society right now. And I do actually often think of different places in Britain, because we talked about there'll be some overlap with when Nathan and I did an episode a while back on what does it mean to be patriotic, which you weren't in, but you no doubt heard. I think you may have been in the room listening from afar. I can't remember. But either way, there are different places, aren't there, that people care about. This is something that Nathan talked about a fair bit in terms of the role of place and why that matters so much. And it's amazing if you're someone listening to this or watching this from beyond our fine shores of the empire, especially if you're in America, you wouldn't know the ridiculous differences between cultures within Britain, though they are unified. Of course, there is such a thing as Britishness, but you go to the northeast, for example, it's very, very different. The kind of culture of the people in certain towns and cities, even in a very small island. And the northeast, I always think is kind of interesting. When I've met people from the northeast, Nathan aside, of course, there's something you can see about. There's a real humility to people in the northeast, and I'm completely armchairing this, so I don't know where it comes from, but I kind of think the northeast used to have a massive Christian basis. There was so much monastic activity up there. Lindisfarne is up there, which the Vikings raided in the latter end of the 8th century, and you've got so much was significant up there. Of course, York nearby-ish, and as a real seat of sort of ecclesial power. But then over time, it's completely changed, as many places have. But there's still some remnant of what the culture looked like there. Sorry, Tom, you go.
No, it was just a single one. Like, I wouldn't move anywhere south of, I think, Birmingham.
Really?
Yeah, because I mean, the culture that is different. I occasionally work in London, and I want to get out of London as fast as possible. Like, it's just a completely different world. And I think you chat about America and the distances, and we feel the same sort of thing. No doubt, the North and the South are entirely different cultures, but we're feeling that within 250 miles.
Yeah. Which is kind of the distance that some people travel to church in America, almost. Some. Sorry, Nathan, you're going.
No, it's true. You're right. I'm sat here in the northeast in Stockton-on-Tees, and you're right. There are cultural differences, and you say even within a very short space of time, there's a different. I joked before about the Smoggies and Geordies thing, but you've even got differences here between people in Stockton and people in Middlesbrough and Hartlepool. We're talking miles, a handful of miles of distance, not very long at all. And historically, it's interesting because, not to get too much into this, but one of the things you could say, obviously, you mentioned it yourself, Aaron, the history of Danish influence and Viking invasions, which is, is it Tolkien who I think broadly, it's not an allegory, is it? But broadly, the dwarves kind of approximate a northeast hardy sort of culture, that northern culture. But also during the Reformation, it was the northeast that were the conservatives in that whole debate. They sort of were the last ones to give up on their medieval Roman Catholicism. There is this latent conservatism that goes back centuries in religion, in culture, in practice. And obviously we would have a different conviction there with regard to Reformation ideas, but the point still stands. The cultural observation is that there is a ruggedness, there is a sturdiness, there is a resistance to southern imposition, and there is a different culture. Again, going back to that Jorvik Danish influence, because for a while it was under Dane law, it wasn't under Anglo-Saxon law. After Alfred the Great, of course, it gave them a certain amount of Danish self-rule. So there's a cultural difference and a cultural resistance that goes back not just a century or two, but many centuries.
Yeah.
So, it's
no,
interesting.
I think one of the questions that I think it'd be interesting to kind of pull apart, unpack, I don't know the demographic of those kind of listening, but irrespective of kind of what you think of this current labeling of the far right and whether or not we kind of sympathize with that or whatever that looks like, I think one of the questions that it'd be interesting to grapple with is kind of mainstream evangelicalism thinks that multiculturalism is a good thing and we should be welcoming people into our culture, and we should be kind of this hodgepodge of different ethnicities, different cultures, different environments. Now, how have we got here? Why did we think that was a good thing? What is that based in, and almost kind of how do you engage with that is my other query.
Yeah, that's too many issues to just answer very quickly, so that will almost be, we will now bounce off that for sure for the rest of our time, probably in various ways, but that's the nub of the issue. And I think, but the interesting thing is Nathan just even articulating our little foray into the Northeast just there tells you that even within Britain there is a kind of germ of what some people think of when they say multiculturalism. Like, because you say, oh, isn't it great that we can hang out with a northeastern man here where he is, and we don't judge him for his northeasterly Viking ways.
You're a southerner, aren't
I'm
you?
a dirty southerner. Actually, you're dirty northerners, really. That's how it should be. We're supposed to be the clean-cut, rich people down south. Yeah, literally, yeah. But yeah, the Jarrow Crusade, wasn't it? Was coming down to protest against the southern privilege. So there's loads of different cultures within Britain, and that is true. So because there's a germ of truth in the notion that cultures clash and or complement each other and help each other, and they learn from each other, it sounds insane to some ears to think that you want to protect a monoculture, you want to protect British culture or Christian culture or something like that, because it's like, well, or there's all sorts of cultures, what are you even talking about? So then they kind of give up and go, well, therefore, when completely foreign cultures start ingratiating themselves into Britain, it's no different to when we had Mercia and we had Wessex and different sort of chiefdoms within Britain, and they just ended up blending together. So the same will happen again. We'll have loads of Muslims, we'll have loads of people from different kind of backgrounds, and they can just blend in, and it'll be just the same as when we had different kinds of Anglo-Saxon and or, I don't know, Christianized Viking cultures and Celts and Picts and things like that coming together, and eventually it will all be a lovely soup, because isn't that what Britain was anyway? So that's almost there is a kind of grain of truth in things coming together. So therefore, to challenge that seems like, well, what are you even standing on? What even is Britain?
I wonder how you map onto that kind of this universalism. So within that, you guys know your history a lot better than I do, but you would have had a shared history of some degree. You're all on the same island. You all kind of culturally are engaging with the same agriculture. You've got the similar practices. So there would have been kind of a universalism across those different cultures, but now that has been taken in kind of globalism and run with, that we each in our own kind of view of the world, we superimpose that on absolutely everyone else. And that's why we think that we can invite Muslims in and we can get on fine, because what we believe to be true, we assume on or presume onto other people, and therefore this universalism is universal.
Just quickly define universalism. I think of that as soteriological, a theological term. What do you mean by universalism? Internationalism or globalism?
I suppose, well, it depends what you mean by those two terms. I suppose the idea is that we hold in the West, we believe that our Western values of things like democracy are fundamentally good, that we're held together by like law, and people should just obey laws because that's what the sign on the road says. And we take that and we impose that, or we presume, one, that it's good, and then we presume, two, that everybody else thinks that is good also. So we think that our values are going to fully compatible with Muslims' values, because we're kind of under the surface, we're just agreeing that we're all people, we're all humans. We all believe kind of X is X and Y is Y, and they'll just fit together nicely. But we falsely, that's an entirely false presumption, and they have no interest in kind of being compatible with us, actually.
I don't really get I wouldn't use the term universalism for that, but like I think it makes sense what you're saying in the sense, Western, a kind of Eurocentric view is what people would often say, is like we believes our civilization is actually the best. And ironically, we're so embarrassed by the fact that we used to think we were the best. We still actually think we're the best because we think that what we learned about us not being the best, multiculturalism, let everyone else's culture thrive at the expense of ours, is best. So we want to impose that on others. And of course, other cultures are just like, oh, great. You're letting me come to your country and like set up shop here, literally in all sorts of ways, and you don't believe in yourselves anymore. I'll take that ticket. That's great.
I mean, Stephen Wolf mentions kind of comments on this and suggests that the white middle class are their own in-groups, out-group. This idea that we kind of we exclude ourselves and we promote that, and we kind of have to be ashamed of anything that is actually kind of ours, that we've created, that anything actually belongs to our own culture, and we need to just be ashamed of it and shun it as far as possible. Yeah,
seems to be the way things go at the moment.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't know you were handing over to me there, Aaron. Yes,
sorry, no, it's hard to hand over when you're in the Northeast, isn't it?
I interpreted the silence as a cue.
Yes.
Yes. So I think
you're just a humble Northeastern man. That's what it is.
That's true. Yeah. I understand what you're saying, Tom, about the universalism, whether or not that's the term. I mean, there's something here, isn't there, latent in the acceptance of multiculturalism, let's say in the last 20, 30 years. And we kind of have to observe that this is very much a post-Blair project. This is, the levels of immigration prior to Blair were in the tens of thousands and the low tens of thousands at that, 10, 20,000. But, since then, Blair led in a certain number, and then under the Conservatives, it just ballooned. So this is very much a post-90s project. And with that sort of, if you guys, the listeners, want to go and look up like the Fukushima end of history stuff, at the end of the Cold War, those old divisions are no longer, and there's a new world, a new Jerusalem that might be in front of us of cultures getting together. But there is certainly latent to that an assumption about the brotherhood of man, that sort of Feuerbach's notion of a brotherhood of man. And within that as well, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that all these social conventions and cultural hang-ups are actually occluding something that makes us truly human. And really, all these things can be so much sloughed off, and we can eventually become something else. So there is a utopianism. There is definitely, whether we want to use the word universalist or not, I don't know. But there is a sense of that something specific is not necessary. Sometimes it ought to be rejected, and in favor of a general sense of the brotherhood of man, a general sense of a human project. That sort of naive utopianism of post-World War II, that we can be a United Nations. And there are political groups that advocate still for a world government, although now we associate that term with conspiracy. There are groups that genuinely, it's called global federalism. This idea that we ought to appoint a global government, and government and individual nations ought to cede their sovereignty to it. But for me, anyway, forgive me, I'm going off on one here, because I think that the term culture ought to be examined as well. And I know I'm always the guy who brings up etymology like word origins, but it is really important here, because the word origin of culture is cultus, which means religion, cult. Actually, it has two different senses. On the one hand, it's agricultural, so it's the tilling of the ground. It's that which is being tilled. It's the work of the people, the shared work of the people. And on the other hand, it's the shared faith of the people. It's that which is being devoted to. And that is actually really significant. I think it's helpful for us here, at least in a couple of senses. First, it shows us that a culture cannot survive. There cannot be such a thing as a culture if you have multiple convictions, each competing against each other, different ways of life, different modes of work, so to speak, each rubbing up against in conflict with one another. But also then, underneath the surface of a lot of this as well is the idea, you've referenced it before, Aaron, I think in this talk, but in this episode, that each culture, there is no such thing as a culture that is better than one another. The different ways of life, the different ways of believing, they're all basically the same, right?
Yeah,
even if those cultures that have come here literally contradict one another, they contradict the way of life that has been here for 1,000 years. They contradict it and they despise it. So there is no way they would be able to cohere. So for me, that when I think of culture, of course, we can think of many, many different types of definitions, but you're talking about a way of life and a way of living, a way of life and a way of believing. And the difference you know, you said before about the argument that, oh well, isn't this just the same as the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes and the Normans or whatever else? The point is that for 1,000, 1,200 years there was a singular coherent sense of Northern European Christendom. And you know, when the Norman invasion happened, this was one Christian culture invading another Christian culture, for right or wrong. There wasn't yet, and yes, it was a cultural end of the world for the Anglo-Saxons insofar as, you know, end of one kind of language and end of one kind of government and the imposition of another. But it wasn't the sort of categorical change that we're now seeing. You know, London is now, the white Anglo-Saxons are a minority in London now for the first time, literally in over 1,000 years. That is significant. And when it comes to how we think of that within the church and what Christians do with it, we have to have some sort of response to that. Are we just saying, well, there's nothing wrong with it? Or are we saying, well, maybe there's a reason to think this is going to create division and it's going to create tensions, and what is the church's response to that? But our answer can't be, well, it's like a natural event, like a tsunami or a hurricane. It can't be that.
Well, or it's just happening. You just have to get over it, accept it. Yeah, I completely agree. I think so Tim Dieppe in an article we could link in somewhere, he wrote an article called "What's Wrong with Multiculturalism" a few years ago, and he makes a similar point about the impossibility of worldviews, conflicting worldviews coming together and assuming you can all get along and that's fine. And in a sense, that's why you have different ethnes, peoples, religions that tend to be located in a certain peoples. And of course, we're not saying you don't want to like religionize ethnicity, for example. That would be a mistake, a huge one. But it's also understandable that in a certain place where people have sprung up and a community is gathered and a nation has formed itself and is able to sort of govern itself, as it were, effectively and produce as a nation, there has been a similarity of worldview. And so then to suddenly impose that something different is seen as a problem. And they're not all equal. They're not all good. So that the tension is, and Tim brings this out in his article, it's almost multiculturalism is kind of anti-mission because it doesn't ever want to change anyone's culture. It says so anyway, even though effectively it does. It's like it's the ultimate universal, to use your term, universalist mode. So we're going to create this overarching idea that controls everything. But actually, we don't want you to. We're going to have different rules for different people because we have to respect everyone's individual culture. But Christian missionaries went from the West and they did impose, or let's say one of them, but they challenged the cultural. They didn't just say, right, I'm going to be completely subservient to the cultural norms. So contextualizing evangelicals like to say, well, let's constantly be subservient to what the norms are, which is why in Western evangelicalism you have this sort of contextualization motif everywhere, which is like, right, what is the city doing? That was the Tim Keller kind of approach. Let's be in the city for the city, and obviously the city kind of swallows them up often, and they're kind of swimming against the tide. They basically don't change the city at all. Nothing. I've yet to see significant evidence of 30 years of evangelical church planting in the city for the city that's actually changed the city. The cities have gotten worse. If you were trying to be salt and light and make them better, what evidence is that they're better?
Well, it reminds me
along
of
Christian principles.
What happens to Lot in Sodom? His tactics change and they become those of the Sodomites.
That's exactly what's happened. We've been actually contextualized by the city. But I get that links to multiculturalism because again that's how it comes back in off the back of all the other stuff. And people, it's really hard for Christians to hear a critique of multiculturalism without thinking racism, far right extremism, etc.
But there's a big irony in here somewhere, and you've mentioned mission. Just that thought that I think behind some of this kind of desire for multiculturalism is wanting to kind of love the abstract individual on the other side of the world who actually doesn't exist, but they don't recognize the price of that, which is their neighbor. And even just the term, who is your neighbor? Well, it's the person who lives next door. It's the person that you run into on the street. How is this kind of multiculturalism loving them?
Well, then the challenge. Sorry, Nathan, you jump. Feel free to impose yourself culturally upon the conversation at will. But I'm just jumping on that. There is a challenge there. This is where the people who are really pro multiculturalism, who are Christians, will say, well, the asylum seeker is your neighbor because you see them and they are, I mean, you can't ever tell the different kind of circumstances they're in. Some might have been attacked by bandits, metaphorically speaking, or literally. They might have fled their country and they're here illegally. But what do you do with them? Once they're here, you do have a duty to love your neighbor. So do they become your neighbor? I would say yes, but it doesn't mean you then have to go, right, I was so glad that I found a Levite battered on the ground. Could we get more bandits to beat up people so that we could find more Levites and help them? That's what we'd love to do. So you can love your asylum-seeking neighbor, even if you don't agree politically that they ought to be in your country. I think that's possible. So you can be extremely right-wing. I'm happy to say I'm right. People call me right-wing anyway. I think we should just go, yes, that is just what it is to be truthful now or something on these issues. Whilst being what traditionally would be seen as left-wing, in the caricaturing, right-wing people don't care about people. We don't care about immigrants. We dehumanize them and think of them as a plague or something. Well, no, you actually want to love the people who are in front of you. How can you do that better? Maybe people on the right have been so busy arguing against immigration, they haven't been as quick to love people around them. So you can do that, but you can do that whilst maintaining an extremely strong stance and say, you bureaucrats, New Labour, in Britain especially, I mean, America has its own version of this, but New Labour has so much to answer for. I mean, I wrote an article about this recently, again, I can link that as well. Douglas Murray's book, The Strange Death of Europe, he cites the famous, again, British people familiar with politics will know the famous Enoch Powell Rivers of Blood speech from, I think, 1976. Correct me if I'm
late 60s, I think, wasn't it?
Was it late 60s or was it?
Yeah.
I thought it was 70s. Anyway, so yeah, so and in that, and that's just famous as like, right, that's terrible racism, etc. Now, of course, he is using terms in there that we wouldn't use.
And he wasn't using it, by the way. He was writing it. He was reading a letter.
Right. That's right. Yeah, he was citing the kind of trying to say, look, this is what English people are thinking right now, and the things that they're facing with a significant influx, even then, of immigration. And he was called out as being absolutely insane, right, for saying that they're like kind of postulating that we might have what would we do if we had 50,000 new people coming a year here? And as Nathan said earlier, and after New Labour's new policies, which were just continued by New Labour, which was David Cameron's Conservatism, it's like it's gone up to over 500,000. So Enoch Powell was like the terrible warmonger, as it were, fearmonger, who was saying this would be so impossible. How could we deal with 50,000 a year? Yeah. And we're like, oh no, we'll go better than that. Don't worry. We'll like do that 10 times the amount, and we'll still say it's good, and we'll still say we need even more. Yeah. Because we're not having as many children. Well, what do you think is going to happen? Yes. And do you think the people who are still a majority culture, which would be, forgetting skin color, native Brits, however we define that, and that's tricky, do you think they're going to be happy with that, with the kind of dismantling of their culture bit by bit? Because these new cultures coming in are not wanting to assimilate. And it's not even right to assume that they should. If I was, for whatever reason, if I thought it was better for my family to go to another country, to go to Uganda, and then just set up Little Britain, and the Ugandans say, why don't you ingratiate yourselves? I'd say, well, I like our traditions. It's not wrong, even in a way. I get it. I don't really expect Polish people or let's say Polish Catholics or let's say Afghani Muslims or something to become British when they're here. That's kind of, this is a completely unrealistic expectation. They ought to love things about their culture in a way. And then so we're just saying, just come and set up shop, have loads of children, get into positions of political influence, and I assume everything will be fine and nothing will be untoward. And you're racist if you call it out. It's good,
isn't it, here to be like surgical in several directions. First, despite the fact that a whole generation and then some has been raised in the post-Blairite paradigm here in the UK, and that includes Christians, and so many Christians raised in that paradigm will hear any questioning of immigration policy as inherently racist. You've already said that, Aaron. And we'll see it as inherently un-Christian, but it's not. I think we have to. I would entirely object to that at a sort of a priori level. That it isn't. Depending on what you can have a different opinion as to how much net immigration you want, but one policy isn't any more or less Christian than another. And if you have someone saying that you want 10,000 immigrants every year rather than 100,000, I would agree with that. And I don't think it is inherently un-Christian to say it. It is more. Here it is like it's like you pee on the Christmas presents if you start questioning that paradigm. And a lot
I've never heard that analogy before. That's quite potent.
Now
This northeastern, I like these northeastern analogies. That's
you say things as they mean. Yeah, and so I think we have to say that to begin with, because this isn't a politics podcast, but there is a problem. There is obviously objectively a problem in having net 750,000 plus immigration every single. That's not.
Nathan, all we need to do is build new houses. Come on.
300,000 houses. We wouldn't, even if we built 200 to 300,000 houses every single year, we wouldn't have enough. And our roads, Americans come over and see, you'll know our roads are small because we had a very small population until very, very recently, and they're not fit for the massive, anyone who's been driving for 20 years or more will know that in the last 10 years, it's become a nightmare here in the UK. It is objectively different now than it was when I was first learning to drive 20 something years ago. But that's a political conversation. I think we can also then start to have a theological conversation within the church about, right, well, how do we think of this? Well, in the early days of the church within the Roman Empire, for example, many cultures were under the banner of Rome, obviously, we know that. And so certain churches would have probably had some degree of ethnic diversity, not as much as one might think, because obviously you're still talking about localized churches with limited ability to travel. But let's say at a port like Corinth or something, you would have had more ethnic diversity. But at the same time, within that, there was a certainly when the Roman Empire becomes Christian, there is a unity in cultus. There is a unity in Christian culture. There's a unity in the same, towards the same ends. And not just that, then we have to start thinking about this as Christian mission then. So forgive me for swiveling somewhat. If we are concerned as a UK church about reaching this nation for Christ, we have to be to a certain extent concerned about the constitution of this country and the makeup of this country. And we have to be worried. We ought to be anxious. That's the right word. We ought to have some degree of anxiety about how we see this country being shaped in a direction that is not just secular, but is anti-Christian, is positively hostile to Christian doctrine. Now, of course, I'm speaking, at least in part, about Islamic immigration, which many Islamic immigrants will see Christianity as shirk, as heresy, as something that is not just wrong but ought to be suppressed in some way. Or, they will not regard with fondness our Christian culture. They will see it as a good thing that Muslims are taking over abandoned churches because Christians couldn't fill them. It is entirely possible, and this isn't about being far right or racist. It's not about us casting any aspersions on ethnicity or anything like that. But it is entirely possible for a Muslim party of Great Britain in, say, 30 years' time to not only gain seats, but gain many of them, gain many seats. It is also, is it not hypothetically feasible for us to imagine that party could even gain some semblance of political power? And within a very short space of time, historically speaking, a country that was established as Christian would soon have, at least to a certain extent, if not outright, a governing influence of Muslims who would, rather of the Islamic faith, that would be hostile to the Christian inheritance. Now, what do we as Christians think about that? And one of the answers is, of course, that we ought to be better in our mission and we ought to be better in our outreach. Of course it is. But I don't think it is unreasonable for us as Christians to go, maybe that wouldn't be the best thing for Christianity in this country. Maybe that wouldn't be good for the peace and the welfare of this nation. And maybe we ought to have something of an opinion about the direction in which things are traveling. I don't think that is inherently racist. I don't think it is inherently prejudiced. I don't think you have to host and hold to sort of ill will towards Muslims or anything like that. You just have to think there are winds of culture here that are blowing, and they're blowing us towards the rocks, and we have to be aware of that.
I suppose I've got three very disparate points just to jump on there, and then I don't know, you guys will jump on those. I want
to jump on his as well, but you go.
Mine only short as ever. So that idea of culture, I think one of the issues, we're talking about culture here. We're talking about Christians. Now, if we don't think that there is such thing as a Christian culture, well, this is where we end up.
Yeah,
right, totally. Like there's no description, there's no substance put to the idea of Christian culture. Like, therefore, this is where we are. A couple of other ones, some stats this week. I saw a statistic that if we continue on our current trajectory, we're going to be a majority Muslim country by 2050, apparently. So Nathan, you're right.
Yeah.
And I forgot what his name was. I was trying to look him up before I kind of came over. There's a guy called Ibrahim, wrote historian, studied kind of the oh dear, no, I'm losing it.
The Crusades guy.
Yeah, the Crusades guy.
Yeah.
He was stating,
the Defenders of the West.
There we go. Thank you.
Raymond Ibrahim.
Raymond Ibrahim. That at no point in the history of the world has there ever been this level of immigration and kind of welcoming of multiculturalism. We are really on kind of new ground. Yeah. And this has never happened before.
Yeah. And that, oh gosh, there's so much to go on for that. And on that one, just briefly, it links back to the old internationalism, which is probably the language they used around First World War, when everyone was trying to talk. A lot of intellectuals were talking about, a new, as Nathan mentioned earlier, this new humanity. We're all together, all holding hands, and isn't especially after the First World War, they're like, well, that was terrible, wasn't it? Let's set up the League of Nations, and that was sort of like a proto. Of course, that becomes the UN in some sense after Hitler made a kind of travesty of it, and we are where we are. The globalism has kind of increased precisely because people kind of think this is a classic liberal view. So for liberal Christians, they're like, oh yeah, because they've thinned out the distinctions of what the gospel is and how it affects people. Sin doesn't really get seen as all that significant, so you can kind of overcome that by just coming. We've all learned something apparently, so we look at the past and we just educate ourselves. This is the Enlightenment view, and educate yourselves out of your sin. So you can't do that. So you can't just decide, oh, it's okay now that we're not like we were 1,000 years ago when they couldn't come together. Now what have we learned? Just because you've had a couple of world wars, you think suddenly we've learned not to be with animosity towards each other. No, you can see that doesn't work. You can see cultures all around the world. There are wars that happen. People are not going to be happy doing this. So it's completely mad. Anyway, the point of going off to your first point, I think, about cultures, is kind of what I wanted to get onto from what Nathan said as well about how the church responds to this. Because if we even I now, in my sort of, rebelling against the evangelical missional agenda that we've been given for decades, and we all are to some extent. We're going in a different direction, let's say divergent from it. Even now, like this week, I've been posting a few more things about multiculturalism or the challenges of the government cracking down on free speech and things like that. And there's still a part of me that thinks, oh, am I getting a bit too political here? Shouldn't we just be focusing on the gospel? There's this kind of, it's like ingrained in you because you're kind of like have been taught. And for most of my Christian life, I've basically stayed entirely out of any of this stuff and been like, I don't understand lots of it. I have opinions of it. I guess I enjoy history and I enjoy thinking about things like civilization, but we're not allowed to go there. And it's always been a weird thing. And Nathan and I have spoken about this for years. Like a love of, you read Lewis and Tolkien or something, and these people that many evangelicals read who had massive opinions about how civilizations worked or peoples and people groups and languages. And it's like, well, that's all irrelevant. Like you just need to get people saved into the church and then that's it. There's no borders really that God recognizes. He doesn't care about nations because he's forming a new nation. That is true. We are a royal priesthood, etc., a holy nation. So therefore, why should we care about anything? But that's not even true. Every Christian, every pietist evangelical Christian does care about the political things that are happening. And increasingly, it's just a backdoor way for a leftward drift in politics, which influences churches. So it's not even that people are actually apolitical because they have houses, they have children, they have cars, they make decisions that are in their life that are based upon the culture around them. So the politics doesn't not affect them. It's not completely irrelevant.
It's also about, and I'll only say this quickly, Aaron, so you can continue your train of thought. It's also about seeking the peace of the city of man. It's ultimately a love of neighbor. That is, to really, in real political civic terms, it is a love of neighbor. In that, even if, I do of course want this land to be reached for Christ, and I do obviously want to see Muslims convert to know the Lord Jesus. I want to see that as my first priority. And of course, it should be. We should speak in those terms. But even if just generally, I want to love my neighbor, and therefore I'm not going to take actions either actively or passively, that lead to this nation and to my neighbours, Christian or not, having a worse time of it, and or be that them or they, or their grandchildren. And in this case, the peace of the city, if I'm to seek the peace of this city, as it were, speaking generally now of the city of man, I'm looking ahead to, a generation down the line. I'm going, this is a recipe for anarchy. Yeah. This is a recipe for chaos. It is not about being right wing or left wing. It does not work. It is not working, and it cannot work. We cannot build enough houses to accommodate everyone. We cannot accommodate multiple cultures, most of which want to kill each other. We cannot do this. And so to seek the peace of the city, to love my neighbor in a civic sense, obviously I primarily want to see their souls saved, but to seek their peace in a civic sense and to love them in that way, I don't want to ordain, either again passively or actively, policies that are disastrous. And for me, it's as simple as that. As someone who might object to what we're saying, it's too political, it's too this, it's again, you not doing anything and you saying it's nothing to do with me, that is an opinion. It is not, you have to make a decision here, and you not doing anything is itself a decision.
Yeah, and we've had mainly examples that we laud in history, of course, of evangelicals who have done stuff about problems, whether William Carey in India, William Wilberforce here, Bonhoeffer against the Nazis, etc. He doesn't just go, right, okay. And Bonhoeffer had more reason than most as a Lutheran, with a very strict law, sort of the Zweireichslehre, the kind of two kingdoms approach. Many Lutherans just leaving the government to itself. God's, that's God's job, as it were, to sort the government out, so we'll just keep out of their way. And actually it meant that Nazi doctrine ended up infiltrating the Lutheran church. So that's why they had to have the confessing church, for example. So there are many examples in history of the church needing to stand against the politics of their time.
It's Russian doll stuff. Remember again we referenced that episode before the beginning, but again harken back to it. It's that Russian doll metaphor. If you're in your street and you've got neighbours, literal neighbours on your street, and you saw that all the wheelie bins in the street were all on the road because there's recently been strong winds and all the rubbish is out on the roads, or you see your neighbour's child, a toddler, going in the middle of the road, and you can see that the parents haven't realized that they left the house. You don't do nothing because you go, that is not my responsibility and I'm spiritual. Interact. You actually get involved. You seek the peace of your road. Well, likewise, if your town has got something wrong with it, and you get the idea. If your town has got something wrong with it, your city's got something wrong with it, your nation, I think it is almost unrealistic to expect Christians not to be concerned about what they're seeing with their own eyes around them, and not to have an opinion, and not to seek the peace of the city of man.
Absolutely. And I think it's even ironic that on two fronts here, right? So let's say the multicultural angle, which is actually a secular ideology, by the way. It's not a Christian thing at all. There's stuff about, obviously, God brings the nations together, but he still cares about the difference between nations and peoples. He wants to bring different tribes and ethnies together. So that's
into
where
a specific culture.
Yeah, exactly. And that's to be Christian. You are to obey his commandments, right? So that's going to look Christian. Yes, it doesn't have to look English Christian everywhere you go, but it's going to be subservient to Christ. And I'm sorry, that just isn't, I'm not even sorry. It's not going to look the same as being subservient to one of the several million Hindu gods or to Allah. And so I think this is part of the issue. So even if you want multiculturalism to succeed in Britain, that if it succeeds, then it fails. Because if Islam ingratiates itself, as it will, because it has to, it's like they can't do anything otherwise they're not being good Muslims. So if you want Muslims to be Muslim fully, then they are going to want to impose Sharia law. There are already elements of Sharia law, as Rowan Williams got in trouble for many years ago for saying it's inevitable. The Archbishop of Canterbury, I think it was 2008, inevitable that there'll be elements of Sharia law that need to be incorporated. That was like, everyone went mad about that. But actually, he was stupid for saying that on one level, but he was also kind of being realistic in a weird way, but he's obviously was very leftward in many of his socio-political leanings anyway. But he was saying something that is actually the case. It is inevitable along the current lines if we continue along these hugely pro-immigration policies and demonize the people who speak out, like Douglas Murray or like Enoch Powell or many others, Suella Braverman, I guess, in more recent times. If we speak about it in strong enough terms, there's people trying to love their neighbor, arguably. And I know that there are going to be actually bad racists that come in and go, I just don't like people different to me. And then you've got to separate that and go, right, how do we chastise the racists who are going to join in the rallies or the protests, whilst, without allowing the left-wing media to basically go, oh, look, anyone who disagrees is like these people. This kind of, everyone's a far-right thug now, as Keir Starmer called everyone.
I mean, let's be honest, it's not just the left-wing media. I mean, recently, I should say the media, by the way. Yeah. I don't want to date this episode too much, but let's just say recently there have been the Olympics, and recently there is been that furore over the openings and it resembling the Last Supper, and then recently there have been some sort of there's been some Christian midwittery, and they're talking about how no, it's not about that. It's a 17th century painting, don't you know? And it's Dionysius, don't you know? It's nothing to do with that. And it's like, yeah, okay, guys, come on, sort it out, sort your lives out. We've got eyes, our lying eyes. Come on, sort it out. But one thing that I did notice in the responses of Christians, and there's one article that got passed around on Facebook, and I saw various church leaders promoting it because they were trying to push back on what they saw as fundamentalism. In this article, it was warning against the latent Islamophobia of many of the responders. And that is not just true in this case of this one woman who happened to be a leader in the Baptist church, but also, if you remember, of course, in various of the responses to some of the issues in August 2024 in England, you have the Archbishop of Canterbury warning against Islamophobia and other figures within the C of E. So what I'm getting at is that when you speak too much about this, certain members in the institutional powers of English Christianity will stop you from even talking about this because they have inherited this language, this paradigm of Islamophobia. I remember being in uni as an undergrad in about 2006, 2007, when this language, this word was just starting to come into common parlance. And I remember thinking that this is bonkers. This is so ludicrous. It doesn't even deserve a response. There's no such thing as Islamophobia. It's just a critique of a religion. As at the time, it was that was the new atheist stuff. No more, it's no more a phobia to critique Islam than it was for Richard Dawkins to commit a phobia by critiquing Christianity. I didn't call him Christophobic. I just thought he was wrong. And it's critique, honest or dishonest, but critique all the same of a religion. And yet now the category has been politicized. Yeah. And if you know that the actual definition of Islamophobia that the Labour Party are wanting to inculcate in the UK into law, employs a racial category. There's this assumption that Muslim entails an ethnic identity, which is madness. Absolute madness. How can a religion entail an ethic?
And I understand that you could say, well,
it's a majority of Muslims who would have an ethic. But even then, the whole point is that it's a religion. You can distinguish between critiquing the religion and being prejudiced towards its adherents. I'm absolutely sure there are some very brave, very noble Muslim men, and to be honest, sometimes the church needs to learn from some of the manliness that Muslims exhibit. But I'm not at all trying to be personally prejudiced. But I think it's entirely legitimate for us to say, hang on a second, something is wrong about this cultural influence that we have imported.
Yeah, there's definitely, and that's a whole other thing that almost it's hard to have that conversation because you're so busy trying to challenge the nonsense of Islamophobia categorizations coming, which Christopher Hitchens, actually, one of Dawkins's old running mates, who's, again, I've said many times, who's my favorite of the new atheists. He was quite a more honest guy. He did that debate with Doug Wilson, etc. He called out Islamophobia, I think, before most, but maybe before any Western intellectual did. He was really there's a video on YouTube. You could just type in Christopher Hitchens and Islamophobia, and it's quite a chilling kind of thing of this is where we're heading, and once we allow this word in, just like all bets are off. And it goes back to the kind of love your neighbor thing you were saying, Nathan, earlier, because you go, if you allow something to go down a certain trajectory, everyone is just genuinely idiotic, naivety to the point of absolute idiocy to think that things aren't going to change in a certain direction. And then if you just shut down everyone as racist Islamophobes who tries to challenge it, go, no, what do you think it's going to stay like this perfect equilibrium you currently have, you think is perfect, it's not even perfect, but it's kind of worked because you've got enough Christendom foundations still here, tolerance, etc. You think it's going to stay like this? You think when you import another 750,000 and another 750, and you keep having fewer children, and people like you and I, Tom, getting chastised for having too many children. I think on Twitter just today, X today, I was challenging something about the housing crisis and the fact that there's 400 houses being built across the road, if you can hear any diggers through the curtains. And they're like, yeah, well, you've got 6 children, so you've added to the housing crisis. So I was like, okay. I said, how many of them would you like me to have aborted? How many children is the right amount before you qualify to be able to challenge this problem about immigration? Because if you're adding nearly 1 million every year or something.
Well, I mean, the stupidity even with that, like, I want net contribution to society.
Yeah.
Okay. Your children are going to contribute to society. The odds are very high.
They better.
Okay. That's not what we're seeing here.
Yeah.
There's 2 entirely different. Like, it's an argument that just doesn't work.
Yeah. No, exactly right. And it goes. This is the whole thing with the Christian response, the pietistic Christian response. Which, if you don't understand that term, that's what you probably are if you're an evangelical and you don't understand. And I don't. And piety is good. We love the Lord. We want to be devoted to Him, but we don't want to do so in such a way where we spiritualize everything, or I guess where we secularize everything that is not, let's say, kind of standard devotional practices. And it means that we don't involve ourselves in politics. We think that stuff's a waste of time or a distraction, or even kind of sinfully distracting for many people. And so we just focus on the gospel, just focus on the church. And that means certain programs, very narrow remit for life itself. But you can't even do that if you don't love your neighbor by challenging multiculturalism. So even if you just want to preach the gospel and have the church, well, good luck doing that when, as Nathan's saying earlier, when those numbers increase, and there are already many Muslims involved in many political spheres. Oh, but they're nice Muslims, they're liberalized. Fine, maybe these ones are, and maybe there is a natural law argument to say, as Nathan says, there's some good virtue to speak. There's lots of Muslims I can talk to in this country where you're more on the same page than you are with a liberal Christian on certain moral issues. So you can have a good conversation. There's bridges that can be built. I'm not saying you demonize all Muslims, but you absolutely have to say at some point, some of those Muslims are going to realize the tradition, the fabric they're part of is not the same thing that they are here. And multiculturalism is not a thing. It's not a foundation. So they're going to realize that Christendom is a different foundation to Islam. Some of them, you meet them in their 20s and 30s. I've played football with lots of Muslims over the years. They get more Muslim as they get older. So
I don't blame
them. I don't pray much. Then suddenly actually I've started to take it more seriously because their parents have died or something, or they realize they're part of a great tradition and they want to keep that going.
And the point is, we can't blame them for it. Like, this is, I do not look askance at Muslims wanting to operate according to their first principles. That's a good thing. It's an honest thing. And isolated in and of itself, the ends might not be desirable, and I don't believe they conform to the truth, which is Christ, but I understand and can respect a Muslim for operating according to his first principles. I don't think we need to be churlish on this. And I also understand why, as you're saying there, they become more Muslim as they get older. That's a good thing. We'd say the same thing about Christians getting, being more honest with them, with their first principles. But at the same time, we have to, as a church and also as a country, say, yes, but that also means if Islam becomes a dominant exprestion within the UK, they will rule according to those first principles when they get into government. And that will mean that there might well be fewer opportunities for Christians, that's putting it lightly, to be honest. We could put it more harshly, couldn't we? Because it depends on what
we're going to
get
taxed, do we not?
Islam becomes dominant.
Yeah. There'll be Islamic finance, and it's also the thing I was saying that even those basic spiritual practices, like let's say street preaching or any preaching, churches having gift aid, that'll be gone soon anyway. But lots of the things that the church that allow the church to do its work, to be salt and light, they won't be able to do that if we have the situation that Nathan describes in 2050.
The madness of it underneath it here, because now let's pivot to those sorts of cultured despisers, right? Sort of the white Anglo-Saxon, so Lib Dem voters, Green voters, whatever, who wouldn't see a problem with this. The thing that they are assuming is that this multiculturalism is natural, and also that it's been here for ages and that it can be here forevermore. When actually this is a recent project that is, in the scheme of history, untested, and all things being equal, if history is going to tell us anything, it will bend towards an equilibrium that does not look like this. So what I'm getting at is there is an assumption that they might make, well, that won't happen. This sort of scenario you've painted, Nathan, in which there might be a Muslim party of Great Britain that rules in a Muslim fashion and turns, as it were, Great Britain in a Muslim direction. That won't happen. Why won't it happen? Well, because look at the last 50, 70 years of Western history. It's like, oh yeah, 50, 70 years in the scheme of 2, 3, 4,000 years of human conviction. That's how that works, is it?
Yeah.
There's no guarantee that a Muslim Party of Great Britain would allow for the same degree of multicultural, sort of multiculture
tolerance,
that we now so-called enjoy. There's no guarantee at all, and the assumption is that no, it will just carry on as normal. It's bonkers. It's absolutely bonkers. And maybe we're wrong, but maybe we're not.
You mentioned Lib Dem there, so I'm just going to jump in with Tim Farron. I mean, he posted something. I think it was last week. We're alluding to the riots, etc. And he posted stating, but there's no rocks being thrown at my church. Well, where does he live?
Yeah.
Okay. And let's think about the rest of society. And then it turned out later in the week, some rocks were thrown at the church.
That was just probably some right-wing Christians going, no, right, let's bring him up to, let's equalise this.
Or indeed the burning of churches in Canada. How about that? Did you guys see that in the last handful of years? The mass burning of churches in Canada, because there was a false story. I mean, we won't be able to go into this in full detail, but there was it was literally fake news. The idea that the church had, in the early 20th century, I believe, had buried various native Canadians, indigenous Canadians, under the foundations, and so there was this assumption, and so there was an outbreak of arson attacks on churches in Canada. So there is, I'm sorry, not just here in Britain, but in the Western world more generally, there is that sort of hostility. I mean, Tim Farron, of course, is a man who, if I'm not mistaken, supports abortion rights and other things. So we're not talking about a man who would comply with conservative Christian principles, obviously.
Yeah,
seems like a decent chap. Don't get me wrong. I could have a cup of tea with him, but I would disagree with him.
But then you could have a cup of tea with a Muslim, presumably as well.
Exactly.
And so it's I think, and Tim Farron is an interesting one. Yeah, as a leader of the third biggest, well, it used to be the third biggest. I presume Reform UK have overtaken them now. Have they?
It depends how you measure it, but
sorry, no. by pure votes, I think Reform. But yeah, not by constituencies. But he was leader of the third largest party as a Christian. So everyone was like, "Wow, that's cool." So a Christian can do politics. But obviously, he got undone by the kind of "what do you think about gay sex?" questions, hedged it a bit, and then regretted. And actually, is a sort of he's an evangelical. He would call himself, which is interesting to have an evangelical in Britain. Who then said, I don't believe in same-sex marriage, so therefore I can't be a politician. It's not possible to do that. And he doesn't think anyone can. I think he said that. I mean, that's an amazing thing to say. Like, the ultimate pietistic thing to say is, I've tried this, and he's, as I said, Nathan said he's not even pro-life fully, or maybe I don't know what his view is on it, but I presume it's not. He's not going to be an abolitionist of abortion, is he?
He supports the liberal paradigm.
Exactly. So
that's what's going on. It's why you see John Stevens of FIEC retweeting him and supporting him. It's the same sort of boomer liberal paradigm that is being assumed. That is
and he ticks enough boxes, doesn't he, to be like, well, I'm not pro same-sex marriage, therefore that qualifies me as a kind of conservative evangelical voice, which is why the Fellowship of Independent Evangelical Churches, John Stevens, etc., will think he's great. But actually, he's actually come out and said you can't be a Christian now in politics. So it's like giving up the ground entirely. So what are you supposed to do? Allow this to happen? Again, it goes back to love your neighbor. Well, that's just too complicated. We can't really get involved in politics. It's really tricky. Well, it affects everyone and everything in so many significant ways. And you're not even going to be able to be a pietistic Christian in Britain in 25, maybe 30, 40 years, or at least not in the same way. You have to go underground as a result.
Yeah, but even that, it is interesting to think that is pietism going to get forced out by this? You're going to have to be living differently. You're going to have to be doing stuff, because if you don't, you're going to be not a Christian anymore at minimum,
Yeah, and presumably many evangelicals will be duped into thinking maybe that's not so bad. Because again, going back to that original question, I think you posed earlier, we don't believe there's such a thing as a Christian culture. So we don't look at the last 1,000 years, 1,200, maybe even longer, actually, if you think of the Roman Christian influence in this country. We don't think of it as Christianized in any way. We just think there were Christians here and there were loads of different kinds of peoples. So therefore we can bring in other kinds of peoples and it's fine. But I think this is something I was getting at in my article, to say cultures do learn and change and adapt and evolve. They do. Britain has done that, right? It's not the same as it has always been, but it has kind of continued along a certain form of principles. And Christianity has always been in the mix until very, very recently, and it still technically is. The king's coronation, etc. It's formally still part of our culture. But as I found in my, my recent tribunal, for example, we've got the judiciary, we've got judges who don't know the Bible anymore. And that wouldn't have been possible just a generation ago. So we are only very recently moving away from what has been over 1,000 years of Christianized culture. Even if that works itself out in different ways, those first principles are the same. So you can't just add in these other things and expect that not to be problematic. So I think Christians who then go, well, is there such a thing as Christian culture? They are going to find, well, okay, let's see what your neutral idea of culture looks like. Secularization of culture. It's not. It's just a different form of religious assent in a different way.
Absolutely. Sorry, Aaron, I didn't have anything. I wasn't saying anything.
So, that's fine.
I wasn't saying anything. I agree.
No, it's good. Tom, any final thoughts from you?
No, I feel like there's an awful lot there.
There's an awful lot there.
I would say as well, one good book to read. I mean, obviously, Aaron, you referenced your article, which people can listen to. You mentioned Tim Diep's article, didn't you, on Christian Concern. Yeah. I think
Douglas Murray, Strange Death of Europe.
Yes, T.S. Eliot, Christianity and Culture is also very, very good. I mean, excellent. Actually, it's a shame we haven't really engaged with it much. We hadn't had the chance, but if there's a PDF online, you can go and find it. But I mean, I think it's important for us to point out, not that we're seeking to sort of be squidgy here, but we're obviously not making an ethnic argument. That's not what we're talking about. We're not objecting to the presence of various ethnicities in one go. If anything else, the church is that sort of, at least it can be, a representation of various different ethnicities in one place. The point, though, is that they share one culture, one cultus, one worship, one mode of living, one mode of believing. And it is when various modes of believing and working come up against each other, some of which are contradictory, that is when the love of neighbor thing comes in. To summarize what we've been saying, it's got nothing to do whatsoever with the color of one's skin. I couldn't care less about the color of your skin. I care about one's heritage. I care about one's history. I care about the preservation of the glory of a nation. I care about all these things. But I couldn't care less what color your skin is. What I care about is that cultus that is shared and developed amongst a people. And I don't think we should be so quick to throw out something that has, as we've said, has been here in this land for 1,000 years, if not longer, and has led to everything that we hold dear, stuff that we're aware of and stuff that we don't even know that it's contributed to. And yet, for the sake of a 50, 60-year project, we're willing to just throw it out. I think the church has to have an answer to that. It has to give an account for that somehow. It can't afford just to sit back and rest on its laurels and say, well, all shall be well, or it's not my concern. If you do nothing, you are doing something.
Absolutely. No, that's really, really good thought. And I think, it goes back to this problem of pietism in the churches where we haven't applied our theology. We haven't applied our faith to actual practices. We've been wary of actually specifying anything. So we've actually, but again, this is a particular issue for Protestants, more so than probably Roman Catholics, I would say. To say, if as soon as you start saying this is what you need to do, if you believe this, then you need to, there's stuff you actually have to do. The New Testament tells you actual things to do and not do. Well, that sounds like legalism. That sounds like we're, cultural. Well, yes, Christianity forms a culture. That's what it needs to do. So any of you listening to this and thinking about these issues, of course, it might be new terrain for you, it might be old terrain for you. But just to challenge you, if you want to actually make a difference, if you want to look at it and think, I'm so helpless, this is impossible, well, band together, find ways of connecting with other Christians who are talking about these things, praying about these things, and connecting together, who actually have a holistic way of thinking about the impact of worldview, how you see the world, according to what principles, who you're obeying, who God is, and what he believes about how humans should act. Think about those things and connect with people and think about what you can actually do to make a difference in this culture, rather than merely lamenting it, merely being frustrated, or just turning your face away from it and pretending it's not happening. Because God's put you where he's put you for a reason. As he says in Acts 17, God calls everyone to repent. He places the borders and the places where people are going to live, and he calls us all to repent. He doesn't say, well, if you're in this nation or you're in that over that border, it doesn't apply to you. No, it does. We're all under the lordship of Christ, whether people believe it or not. And so those who do believe it and those who live it out have a duty to ensure that those maxims, those principles of what it means to be in his kingdom are lived out for the good of their neighbor, even if their neighbor will spit in their face as they do so. So on that friendly note, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Defy the devil and act like men. Christ is Lord. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Christ is Lord. I said Christ is Lord twice because he really is Lord. God save the King. This has been That Good Fight. Fare thee well until next time, brethren.
Amen.